If everyone has their data out in the open, they don't feel precious like they're being compared in a negative way. There's incentives to make things better, but we also let all of these open source tools consume from a curated, trusted data source. So open source is almost like that trusted gate to good data.
Hello and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Asim Hussain. So welcome to this podcast episode. My name is Asim Hussain. I'm the Executive Director and Chairperson of the Green Software Foundation, and I'm also the Green Cloud Advocacy Lead at Microsoft.
Hello, I am Chris Lloyd-Jones. I am one of the co-chairs of the Open Source Working Group at the Green Software Foundation, and I'm also head of Open Technologies at Avanade.
Hey folks, I'm Dan Lewis-Toakley. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm also a co-chair of the Open Source Working Group at the Green Software Foundation, and I'm the Green Cloud Lead at ThoughtWorks in North America.
Woo! So it's actually so amazing to have so many people focused on green software and in these environments. So Chris Lloyd-Jones, so you are at a conference today and you're talking to people about open source software and green open source software, aren't you?
Yeah, that's correct. So I am at Build today, or specifically, I'm at the UK chapter in Reading, near London. And it's a pretty timely topic, this one, because I co-presented this morning on green software. And there's a really big discussion, started with the Green Software Foundation, then we quickly moved on to CNCF, the DPIA, and tons of other open source communities. What was cool is everyone's first thought was, how can we work with each other? And also, what is green software? So...
Yeah, what is green software? So out of interest, what is the general impression of people as to what is green software? Because this is a question which is just, I think, going to constantly be redefined year and year and year.
It's interesting, actually, because I've seen three broad definitions. The first one was sustainability with technology. So anything from Microsoft Sustainability Cloud, things like how you track people around your building to make them more efficient. So using technology to make things greener. Then there was software, which is, from my point of view, intrinsically green. So making code greener and emit less emissions. And I think that the final piece was kind of some combination of the two. So things like using green software for carbon accounting, which was interesting because I don't really consider that, because I tend to assume that a lot of the accounting protocols like blockchain are inherently not green. So, which I might be a bit out of date on now. But yeah, three definitions there.
When both of you talk about kind of green, because you're both leading the open source working group in the foundation, what do you think of when someone says, what is green open source software? What is open source green software?
I can have a stab, Sim. I suppose maybe two starting points. One is open source information. I suppose it doesn't necessarily need to be code, right? It could be data or research, but open and readily available tools, frameworks of research that help enable practitioners in the technology space to build software that is greener. And what we mean by that is software that consumes less, energy, particularly dirty energy, and that emits less carbon. And so we've got quite a wide gambit within the open source working group to sort of explore and discover and help drive and accelerate projects, open source projects that help really enable that space. And I think that's been predominantly our focus over the last year. But I think another component is trying to find and understand and accelerate software itself that is doing things in a greener way. And so maybe leveraging some of those tools or frameworks that we've discovered, but to help create examples of, software that's written in a greener way as sort of ways for others to learn through that process. So some of the ways that I like to think about it.
Yeah, I guess I broadly agree with that. So I like the way you started, because I think about the three opens: open data, open software, and open hardware. So kind of sharing those different approaches to kind of collaboration and making a lot of important information available outside of large corporates for the common good. And then for me, green software, I do think about carbon and reducing electricity. I also like to think about the planetary boundaries theory, which I'm probably always banging on about, but also thinking about in future, how might we think about e-waste, pollution, and even vague things like land usage, reducing chemicals, which are much harder to affect in any way as software engineers, but I still think we could have some impact.
I think that's one of the space. That's kind of one of the challenges that we've have is that trying to get everybody focused in on this space, I think required a lot of narrowing down the targets, and a lot of us really talk about carbon emission and things like that. But you're talking about planetary boundary. There are other things. There are other problems. Believe it or not, there's other problems in this world other than just carbon emissions. But and I think you're right. I think we will over time kind of open that gate open. But I don't quite feel that we're getting there. But I don't quite feel like the carbon problem has been solved just yet. Although I was kind of worried because I know we've been chatting to Boa Vista, which is another and they've released their open source API, their carbon API, and one of the things it does, I forgot, Chris, what the different it tells you the carbon emissions. It's an API where you can provide it, a JSON description of these are the machines I'm working on. This is how much CPU I use, etc. And it returns you not just your carbon emissions estimate, but also I think it was primary energy, and I forgot what the other one they were returning, abiotic.
Yeah, there was also the manufacturing. So they broke it down into the different scopes, didn't they? Scope 1, 2, 3, and broke it down in that way, which was interesting.
But also beyond carbon, it was also
the minerals, and reclamation,
and that stuff as well, which I think is interesting. They're also looking to broaden out the scope of green to beyond just carbon to other things as well.
I like that because my concern is where is the tipping point? Because so many organizations have net zero carbon targets, either in the next few years or decades in the future. I do think that now is the time to stay narrow, but eventually we might have to widen out because otherwise, if you leave it too late, almost, who's addressing the other problems? But yeah, I think now we're still in a good space at the moment.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting trade-offs, right? Because as we're building these tools and frameworks, we want to architect things in a way that deliver value in the short term in terms of, quantifying and measuring carbon emissions. But we don't want to build in a way that it's going to be really difficult in the future to consider other factors. And so we want to think about our interfaces and design tooling in this space that can be extensible to future use cases, not beyond carbon, which is really interesting problem to think about.
Oh, beyond carbon. That's a good title for something. I'm not too sure what.
Maybe a future podcast episode.
Future podcast. And I think you hit on something there as well, Chris, which is it's about the targets. So organizations so if an organization sets a net zero target, that's a target related to carbon, and therefore all of the underlying infrastructure and tools and everything tools up to solve the carbon problem. But then I don't know what an equivalent. I have no idea actually what an equivalent target would be for some of these other things. I know at Microsoft they also look at. I just want to say the word water. I want to say potable water. Water scarcity is one of the key things they're looking at, and e-waste, and they have set targets for that as well. It's just not as high as the carbon target. If you want to get something done, you talk about the carbon target.
In a way, I feel like it's because carbon isn't easy, but it's graspable now in a way that it wasn't before. And I think the UN SDGs are at that same level of the greenhouse gas protocol in the way that was, and that, high level government, global target, but we now need to do that same work of translating it into impactful actions that we as individuals can have. There's a great book called Mission Economy, which looks at things like the NASA moonshot and how you can identify these bold challenges to make those targets achievable, like what you're talking about, like net zero.
Oh, I like that a lot. Yeah. So we are supposed to be here talking about open source.
Yes. Yeah.
We're talking in general. We've just gone in general round circles a little bit. But what are some kind of open source projects that you could point to, some maybe some of the stuff working in the foundation, but also stuff outside of it related to green. What are some green open source initiatives?
I'll probably refer to one of Dan's actually first of all, because it's one that I actually use and like.
He's probably not going to refer to it because he's so polite. He's
that's what I was thinking.
I didn't want. Yeah, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that.
The Cloud Carbon Footprint Calculator. One of the initiatives that I know you're a part of is which I use day in, day out, tracking kind of the carbon footprint from many different clouds, and helping people to identify where they might be able to shrink that. And I think that's great because it's an organization just making something that others needed and just sharing it for the common good. and it does seem to have active pull requests and issues, and people are very welcoming. So that's one I particularly like.
Do you know, let's dig into that, because that's actually quite interesting, because I think that touches on some interesting areas, because there are some closed source versions of Cloud Carbon Footprint. So that's an interesting angle to talk about that as well. I mean, what are some of the advantages of having something like cloud? So just for the benefit of everybody else, Cloud Carbon Footprint. Actually, why don't you give an overview of what Cloud Carbon Footprint is, Dan?
Yeah, so Cloud Carbon Footprint is an open source tool, mostly developed by ThoughtWorks, where I work, but also we have many contributors in the open source community and some of the members of the Green Software Foundation. And the way that the software works is it connects to cloud provider APIs, and it supports AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. It connects to the usage and billing APIs, and then with a custom methodology based on best practice and academic research, we convert that usage data in terms of compute, storage, networking, and memory, firstly into a quantified energy consumption or an estimated energy consumption. And then based on publicly available data sets of emissions factors based on where that cloud usage exists, what data center, the cloud provider, we then convert that into estimated carbon emissions. And it provides the data in a front-end dashboard where you can view it in some data visualization, but you can also just consume it via API or a CLI. We wanted to provide a way to understand and explore that data in a variety of different ways based on the context. And we recently added support for on-prem, where you sort of provide your data in a CSV format and we estimate on-premise. And also, like you mentioned with the Boa Vista API Asim, we added support for embodied emissions as well based on the carbon intensity standard. But yeah, it's a tool we've sort of put out there about a year and a half ago, and it's sort of grown in popularity and usage in that time. So something we're hopefully a little bit proud of, and we hope to see people use. One thing I will add, you notice I said the word estimated energy consumption. It's not the same as the actual energy data that cloud providers would have of their data centers, and major cloud providers all sort of provide different tooling using potentially more accurate and measured approaches for the usage. But as you say, Asim, it's sort of closed box in some way. It's to varying degrees, it's a little bit of a black box in terms of where that data is sourced. And so there's interesting, we went for a trade-off of easier access to the data, better usability, better overall support with multi-clouds, because we don't have access to the underlying data. So there's like that trade-off with accuracy versus sort of usability, in various contexts.
I liked your mention of and reference to closed source tooling as well, because one thing that your project made me think of, and a number of things the Green Software Foundation are doing made me think of, is that we launched as a foundation the software carbon intensity standard last year in the alpha version. And I'm glad that was done almost early in the development of this software, because there was already starting to be a lot of different organizations measuring the carbon intensity in many different ways. So by having this standard early, I feel like it's going to help a lot of these open source and closed source companies at least settle on a way that they're comparable. There's an incentive to drive carbon down.
This has more been our longer term planning, but we've talked a lot about, imagine if users of these various tools or software could optionally opt in to sharing some of the statistics or data about maybe their company size, number of employees, industry, and some of the outputs of these various tools into some sort of centralized way to understand comparatively across industries, what does good look like, what does not good look like. So not just you internally using the SCI to measure against yourself, but how could you compare against competitors or other comparable organizations in some way? I think we might be a little bit a way off from achieving that, but it'd be really interesting to think about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it might just only happen because you're talking about using the Cloud Carbon Footprint as an SCI measurement. Is that what you described? Yeah.
I believe we haven't implemented the SCI yet within Cloud Carbon Footprint, but it's definitely on the roadmap.
Yeah. Just in case we haven't mentioned it for the audience, because we're getting into that phase of our field where we just kind of dive straight into our own kind of terminology. So the SEI is a measurement methodology being developed in the foundation for essentially scoring a software application for carbon emissions. So just going back to cloud carbon, I think it's an interesting. I think there's a debate out there. An old debate, open source versus closed source. What are the advantages, disadvantages of each? And I think this is, again, just a great example, because every single cloud, we've actually had a podcast episode about this, talking about all the various cloud and they're different. Everyone will have their own measurement tooling. And whereas Cloud Carbon Footprint is an open source one. And I think one of the interesting things about that is it's actually a lot easier to engage with because of the openness. I remember, Dan, when you reached out to me kind of wearing my white Microsoft hat to engage, it was actually quite challenging to get people to kind of start having those conversations with you, because everybody's there thinking, well, what can we say? Like, I don't want to reveal anything. There has been NDA signed and all this other stuff. Whereas as soon as something becomes open source, boom, it becomes easy. It's easy. It enables that collaboration, and then everybody can just see the work that you're doing. They can verify. There's no hoops to jump over, and that's kind of one of the clear kind of advantages of open source. I would see is well, whatever. I don't even know what word to use to describe what I just said. Like collaboration. Well, I suppose that's the fundamental nature of open source is collaboration. But anyway, actually, no, it's not. I'm rambling now, but it's to be open, but it enables collaboration in a way which closed source solutions don't.
It cuts through legal and governance and technical barriers too, because I don't think it's just a green thing. If you look mid-pandemic, there were lots of people struggling with solutions for vaccine passports, and you had cities and towns in the US collaborating with universities across Europe, collaborating with small villages from Australia. And can you imagine those three very geographically and size different organizations collaborating without open source? It wouldn't have happened. So it provides visibility, I guess, and a shared platform too.
Yeah. With closed source, you can't, like, your methodology is it's out there. It's completely out there. Every single number, and people can review it and back it up, and it builds that trust in you. So essentially you're creating something which provides data which makes decisions. But everything is out there and open to be reviewed, which is a real advantage.
I guess open source isn't always great too, because one of the things...
What?
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I love open source. It's what I do day in, day out, but I want to be real. There are challenges which organizations and people need help overcome. First of all, you get a lot of people working on it outside of their desk around their day job. And I guess in the foundation, we've probably even seen that means that people might tag their name to a project but not have the time to commit, or things get spun up and they go stale. I think open source is sometimes seen as a panacea for let's just get something cool done without thinking about all the hard work and support that needs to go to make that work.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to Chris, in that open source doesn't mean that you don't need things like leadership and project management and product development and thinking, right? Like, there are still some of those core roles and responsibilities that would be required with any in-house software development team is still sort of required. It might be a little bit more piecemeal in that it's provided by different community members and sort of globally in different time zones around the world. But some of those key aspects to successful software development are still really important. And oftentimes I've seen organizations just, there's this, like, let's use this open source tool, bring it in, and they, don't actually invest some of the time to understand how it's working, or invest time in investing back into the tool itself. So there's still some of that work involved. One other note I'll make is that you mentioned the legal side of things, Chris. I think we thought long and hard about the license that we were going to use for Cloud Carbon Footprint. And for us, we settled on the Apache 2, which is similar in terms of permissiveness to MIT. And we felt it was really important to have a license that allowed anyone, any organization or individual in the world to use the software in any way they wanted. If that meant they were going to take Cloud Carbon Footprint code and build a paid closed source service using that code, that was okay for us, because for us, it's about engaging the community and growing adoption of this tool and similar tools, rather than necessarily holding it tight to our chest and trying to have the secret sauce that, that we want to provide to our clients or to partners. So that's sort of a key aspect. Different license types, more restrictive ones, can often be a deal breaker for some companies and organizations to adopt software.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but sometimes it can also feel like, when you've got a toddler or a child is holding a sweet and you have to kind of prise their fingers off it. At times for an organization, it can be quite hard to make that decision. And I say that because we've contributed some code as Avanade to the Green Software Foundation. It's the start of that CI/CD pipeline tooling. But one of the reasons why I push for that is because I also think if you keep that secret source close to your heart, you run the risk of people, first of all, jumping over you because they just want to get things done. They want to get things done quickly. What you do becoming out of date and stale, and then you've invested a whole load of time in something which isn't compatible with what people are now using. You can also just look like a bad actor, particularly in fields like this where we're not, making a search tool in comparison to the whole OpenSearch, Elasticsearch furore. We're trying to actually solve a problem here where fundamentally, if the world doesn't go net zero, we might all die in a massive heat death. There's good reasons to do it.
I think that's also where this is one of the things I recognized earlier in the foundation because, hey, look, let me be honest. Both of you work for organizations that are competitors. Let's just be out front. You're competitors, right? But what's wonderful, I realized, is that open source is a way you can collaborate with each other. Because there is an underlying layer. Every single time you talk to a customer and you're going to be implementing something, there's an underlying layer of trying to solve a problem, which is common. And that's kind of really what the advantage of open source is. And Dan, I love the fact that you use that permissive licensing. I always like, even in the foundation, we've used MIT for some but for our content is Creative Commons. I've forgotten the one where you can just make a derivative and just rename it and sell it like the most because it's all about how do you kickstart this ecosystem than anything else. Yeah, open source is again collaboration between a method of collaboration between organizations that would typically be competitors. I think is beautiful. Yeah,
and it's nice to be able to sit that aside, but also you avoid all the antitrust concerns operating out in the open. In a way, it also removes a lot of the kind of the waving of I did this, you did this, because people can see what you worked on. They can see you join these meetings, which means we recognize the contributions of those that don't write code, which is an important piece that's often overlooked because consensus, meetings, design, discussion is as important as everything else. But you can also see the code and the minutes, which is nice.
I don't know about you both, but I love feedback. Like I love getting feedback, and there's nothing better than me pushing out some code to a project and then getting a pull request or an issue correcting me and say that I was wrong about this. And sometimes that can be a challenge, but open source provides so much more scope for a feedback mechanism from experts and community members. And it allows projects like Cloud Carbon Footprint, but many others to sort of better course correct towards things that are valuable because you have more feedback and more users, giving you, improvements as you go.
I think open source is a bit of a mindset as well, because I'm not going to be as nice. I sometimes like feedback, but I have to be in the right mindset to accept it. Other times I'm like, I just want to get on and do things. But open source does get you into that mindset of going, actually, no, hang on, they've got a point. I'm wrong. I can acknowledge it and we can move on. When you're in that headspace.
I think it gets a lot into kind of psychology and where you are in your life as a human being at the current moment in time as to whether you can accept that feedback. But it's always, I've seen feedback where I'm like, that is not okay, or that's. But then again, even that feedback is public, so that conversation is not happening in private, so you can then it's happening, and then you can correct them. And do you think you reminded me of something? One of my, I don't know if it's related. I'll say it anyway. One of my kind of happiest moments with the foundation was when my first pull request got rejected, or the first time one of my pull requests got rejected, because I was like. Thankfully, there is a community of people and they're confident enough to kind of feedback to each other and kind of reject things and accept things. And I was like, excellent. This is going to, the culture's there. It's going to work. Yeah, being okay with having pull requests rejected must be a really important thing in any kind of open source community.
Yeah, I like the visibility that gives, though, because it's a bit of a learning experience. And as long as it's public, others can then see what the feedback was that they gave to you. I think the only thing I struggle with sometimes is making sure people can give that negative or critical feedback in a way that you can learn from it, because you don't want to put off future contributors. I feel like if it's your first one, you can also feel a little bit burnt too. Particularly for junior devs, I see them contribute once, get strong feedback, and I'm like, I'm scared of this now.
I think you mentioned the word culture, Asim, and I think that's really important. Different communities, or they're a foundation or a particular open source project, have different cultures. And I think being deliberate about the type of culture that you want to foster is really important. I know at the foundation, early days, we worked on some cultural principles to underpin how we engage within the foundation. I think similar thought process is really useful for open source projects. Having a really grounded code of conduct. Ideally, you don't ever need to use the code of conduct, but it's important that it's there in case, people sway away from the intended culture. And Chris, I love your example of like that junior dev submitting and then getting negative feedback. I've seen it happen. I think something that I like to think about is before providing direct or constructive feedback, like ask a question instead, like why, ask questions to understand before delivering any sort of judgment or value in terms of people's contributions.
Yeah, questions is a great one, particularly being out in the open and chatting, because I know internally and in the past, this is certainly something I'd like to think I've learned from. I can see something and I take a negative intention from it. And it goes back to that psychology piece. When you ask, often you find there are really good reasons for why someone did something the way that they did. And it also brings you closer together to work together in the future. Sorry, we're making open source sound really touchy-feely now and good, but good things get done with open source.
No, it is. It should be. I think there's a human component to everything, which I think really does need to be addressed. And I think it's like you remember me, Dan, because that was one of the, and I'm trying to find it right now. I can't find it, but I remember we wrote, I think we wrote in our manifesto, assume good intent, which I think is one of the hard, we have to actually have that at Microsoft as well, like assume good intent. And like ask, and that's and it's the hardest advice, it's great advice to give. It's hard advice to remember to use. We sound so wise here, but I'm sure there's many times that we kind of fail to do that ourselves. But yeah, asking that question, why, what was your reasoning behind this? Instead of this looks dumb. So what are your reasoning behind this? And then you realize, that's a really good reason. That's kind of how it goes, yeah. Should we talk a little bit more? It's great just for us to talk about generally kind of open source kind of challenges and solutions. I'm just wondering, do we want to kind of touch on some more of the kind of green open source projects that are happening? I know, Chris, you just mentioned a CI/CD tool. I forgot what CI/CD stands for.
Continuous integration, continuous deployment.
All right. Okay. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that was a contentious naming. And then there's also the Carbon Aware software development kit. Those are two of my favorite projects that we have because they come at a very similar problem at very different parts of the developer lifecycle. And I'm excited with the fact that the Green Software Foundation has a lot of different roles and people in it. So we've got developers, we've got data scientists, we have business folks. And what the I'll start with the CI/CD tool. What that does is that lets developers at the moment ingest their infrastructure as code, I guess almost the design patterns for the code that you want to end up in the cloud, the services which you want deployed in Azure, Amazon, Google, and other cloud providers, and forecast what the likely carbon emissions are going to be. We would like to do static code analysis, but it's a hard problem. It doesn't do that yet. So you forecast. The Carbon Aware software development kit is almost the next part of the chain. Once you have your applications up in the cloud, you have your infrastructure, this lets you instrument them to figure out what times of day should this software run, when is the energy clean, where should this run, and manage your workloads. Then you have tools at the other end that can look at that forecast of both the infrastructure and when software should run and tell you the actuals. So I feel like we're getting a really whole end-to-end view of here's the forecast, here's what actually happened, and we're slowly plugging the gaps so that every part of what a developer would do is covered. And that makes me really excited.
I actually hadn't joined the dots between the CI/CD static analysis and the Carbon until just now. Because what the CI/CD tool will do is, I can point it to my GitHub repository of my entire backend application, and it will, just by looking at, my Docker files, try and figure out, these are all the instances you're going to probably create. This is probably what the utilization is going to be, and therefore this is probably what the carbon emissions will be. And the Carbon Aware SDK is what that does is it essentially gives you advice. I don't know how to describe it regarding like when is the cleanest time of the day to run stuff, and I never really joined those two together so you could actually figure the actual carbon emissions and potential carbon emissions out. Oh wow, okay.
So forward looking, and then what Dan's got, like the cloud carbon footprint, is almost that backwards looking viewpoint. So eventually one day we'll get that delta between this is what we forecast, this is what happened, how can we slowly close that gap and figure out what bits can we improve more. And in an ideal world, every part of everyone's job could just be greened in that way, which would just be awesome.
One of the thoughts I've had for the longest time is I like the way you phrased it in terms of the software development life cycle.
Yeah.
And that's the way I kind of think about what we need to get to. It's kind of wouldn't it be great if as you're developing code, like on your laptop, you had information there and then that would inform you somewhat about, well, you've just made this, I'm not even going to call it code change, but architectural change, some sort of change to your software. By the way, it might have, this, this change might increase your carbon emissions somewhat. And then I always imagine, well, what's the next stage in every developer's journey is to check something in and push it to some sort of GitLab, GitHub, whatever it is, code repository. And then that's what you're describing, Chris, is kind of like that static code analysis there at that point, through some actions. So then you can see like, well, my push, my code change merged in with the actual code base estimates this kind of impact. And then once you actually are deploying that into production, that's when tools like the cloud carbon footprint. So I like the way so I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, kind of all that chain through. And all of that really has to be open source. Maybe apart from the deploying to maybe cloud providers could come up with their own proprietary way, but everything else in that journey probably has to be open source.
And even they're collaborating, because if you look at Google, Amazon, and Azure, it's in their interest to make it as easy as possible to get on their cloud. People don't want to be locked in. So in a way, people are competing on the quality of their services, but not how you get the information into them.
That's a contentious point. Should we dig into that a little bit?
Go for it.
I don't know, because I've had that, because I think there is, and I know Chris Adams as well has this idea as well of if you have open source, if you're building something on some kind of non-vendor locked-in open source system, let's just say Kubernetes, for instance, you then have the freedom to move and you can therefore use that power. If provider A isn't adhering to some green standard or something, you can easily move to provider B. Is that kind of what the open source?
It is. Yes. I can see where you're going with that, is that when you start to use vendor-specific extensions, you then get cruft and little bits of lock-in, little hooks in your code, like dragging a fish out of the water that make it really hard to move from one to the other.
But also, I would argue that I've heard, and I'm not an engineer in those platforms. I don't have first-hand knowledge. This is second-hand information. But the more vendor lock-in you get, the more efficient the actual platform is. Does that make sense?
I think that was the case, and I'm going to strongly push back on that one. I will repeat the fact that I am at Microsoft Build at a Microsoft conference, and later today I'm going to be talking about Azure Container Apps. But that is built on Dapper. Dapper is a non-green project, the distributed application platform runtime. What that does is it takes all these vendor lock-in pieces.
It's open source.
It's totally open source. It was contributed to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. What it does is it hides all these proprietary pieces behind abstractions. So you're not using an Azure SQL database or RDS in Amazon. You're just storing data. You aren't needing to know necessarily how even Kubernetes works. It has different building blocks, calling services, saving data, publishing, observing, and secrets. And then it has little adapters, which gives you that developer productivity of moving fast. So allowing you to stay efficient, allowing your apps to stay small so they can be carbon efficient whilst not locking you in. And that to me is the ultimate expression of freedom from one place to another. So that really services, again, is all you care about.
Another example I might add is Spotify's open source Backstage tool that provides an interface for developers to deploy resources across all the cloud providers, but many other infrastructure and services as sort of like a central dashboard for them to do it. And the reason I mention it is we actually recently worked with Spotify to publish a plugin for Cloud Carbon Footprint. So if you're using Backstage, you can now sort of install the Cloud Carbon Footprint plugin, connect it to your cloud providers, and get that same data and data visualization within that platform. And I think that's a really neat example of different open source communities collaborating in a way and adding building blocks together to build better solutions, which I think was really neat.
Yeah, I love it. Backstage is another great example because that does a similar thing of dividing up tools into categories: infrastructure, monitoring, discovery, and letting developers pick what's right for them through that agnostic portal. Yeah, it's awesome.
I see now. So I'm standing corrected. Well, Or I suppose we're all learning together.
But to your original question, like, are there efficiency gains or cost gains? I'm going to give you the classic consultant answer. It depends. It depends on what your goals are, right? If your goal is to get the most efficient bang for your buck in terms of dollars spent, then having a deep partnership with a single cloud provider where you can negotiate every single cent for all the instances, like, maybe that produces the best gains because you pay a lot of money for that. But is that your goal? Is your goal to scale most effectively? Is your goal developer effectiveness, developer efficiency? It really depends. The trade-offs. I like to think of software architecture or software in general as trying to pick the least worst decision.
Yeah.
Right.
There's always trade-offs. There's always downsides.
Always trade-offs, yeah.
People often think of it as Lego, but I think of it as marble run because you've got this whole runs. You've got to get the marbles to fit through as quickly as possible. I like that because it shows like the Rube Goldberg-esque like maze of parts and pieces.
Yeah, that actually fits with me because playing with my son's like, but I do play with his marble run a lot. Both of you mentioned Chris, you mentioned Dapper, and Dan, you mentioned Backstage, and they essentially sounds like facades to, here's me like bringing up my design patterns from, I did used to code, but facade for essentially kind of the wide range of, not, well, in this example, cloud providers and kind of their interfaces. And so maybe it's like a layer thing, like, as long as it's a thin layer on top where you could have like all the optimizations underneath, but like the interface layer itself is the same. And that's kind of where open source comes in. And I was going to say, Dan, like that's one of the big things about cloud carbon footprint is it's multi-cloud. And the only way that could be is if it was the only way a multi-cloud solution could exist. Well, I take that back. If there was a startup creating it, they could do it. But the only realistic way it's going to create is if it's open source, because I know, like, I think I can say this, but like Microsoft, I think it might be obvious that Microsoft's got its cloud platform, but they also, shock horror, use other cloud platforms as well. And then they're asking questions, well, you've got your wonderful tool. Like, can you Microsoft, can you make your carbon measurement tool calculate my Azure and my Google workloads? And like Microsoft would never, it's like legally, that's just a minefield. You wouldn't even go in that direction from a closed source tool. But like an open source would actually allow that. So that's kind of like creating a facade amongst lots of different cloud providers or lots of different APIs. Chris, I feel, has a different opinion. Or
No, I don't think Microsoft would never do it. I mean, look at Azure Arc. That's exactly what that's trying to do.
Yeah.
But actually, a lot of the underlying tech from Azure Arc, there are other cloud providers out there too, is open source as well.
Yeah. So that's maybe like the mechanism that would allow that kind of cross. So from the feeling I had is like if you can't publish while you're saying your Amazon number is X, then you won't. So if you could publish that in some open source, if that methodology for why you're calculating Amazon numbers a certain way is public, then that's going to stop you from any legal ramifications.
And does that take us back to the SCI data project, like another open source project at the foundation, in that we're trying to get providers and vendors and server manufacturers to share their data publicly to prevent these legal concerns? If everyone has their data out in the open, they don't feel precious, like they're being compared in a negative way. There's incentives to make things better, but we also let all of these open source tools consume from a curated, trusted data source. So open source is almost like that trusted gate to good data.
Yeah, trusted I think is the big word there. And I think by the fact that, the open source working group, there's like a collection of people sitting there curating it, experts in the field. That's what gives it the trust. Because I can create open source data in my I have got several open source projects that no one should trust.
Heavy burden, but Dan and I and yourself, we're trusted in this. One day we're going to have our equivalent of Elasticsearch and OpenSearch, I'm sure. But it's cool to be included in all of this, to be honest, and to see where it's all developing at speed.
Yeah.
Chris, you've done a much better job than me at going over the projects in the open source working group. I've barely listed any. I might list one more to add alongside the ones you mentioned, is the SCI Open Ontology project, which looks at a different part of the problem domain of the software carbon intensity standard. So when access to the trusted data, which you mentioned, Chris, is totally a problem that we're really trying to solve. But another problem, let's say you do have the data, another problem that comes up when trying to utilize the SCI standard is, where do I draw the software boundary? Let's say you have some software running on an instance in the cloud and you have a database, and then you have a large number of users maybe accessing that API or something. do you include all of the end user devices that are being used to access that API? Do you include the networking over the internet to access it, or do you just include the software code that's running? Like, making those decisions is something that is up to users of the SCI. And so the Open Ontology project is about defining a standardized way of making those decisions about how and where you draw the software boundary, so it can be consistent and a lot easier for people to sort of make those decisions.
Yeah, which is important. I guess it helps the training as well, because you made an awesome workshop, which again, you shared with us around how to calculate SCI. And I tried running it at our organization, and it's incredible actually when you get people using tools like the SCI and you think you've written something really clearly and had people adding up all these different kilowatt hour figures, averaging them, doing them together, picking different R figures from month to API call, and R is a part of the SCI calculation. So the SCI Ontology project you mentioned is almost like a training tool to help standardize the way people do that. But yeah, and I will share more details of that workshop, by the way, because it was a car crash in a good way. I learned a lot.
Awesome. I'm meant to be running in a couple of weeks, so yeah, we should chat.
Yeah.
My advice on workshops, I used to do a lot of workshops, is like, just make it as simple as you can and then make it 10 times simpler, and there'll still be people struggling. So yeah, it's always a challenge. We're reaching kind of the end of the hour that we have. I just thought maybe I'd love to kind of ask you a more broader question, actually, each of you, to see what's going on in the world. So, what else in the world of green software has kind of got your attention recently? I'll ask that to Chris first.
Ooh, I feel really put on the spot now. Can I go off piece and just pick something which I think is really cool in open source generally?
Sure.
So that is that the United Nations, the US federal government, and the European Union have all set up open source project offices and are collaborating. And a lot of them are looking at digital public good, which includes green software. So the fact that you have not just your traditional corporate community and other organizations, but also now governments taking part, that's incredible. As long as their heft and size doesn't put off other people and having a chilling effect, I think this is going to be a really great sign for collaboration of the future.
I'm going to give you two things that I'm thinking about. One, you sort of touched on this a bit, Asim, in the software delivery lifecycle and how we think about that. Something that I've been talking with our clients about and partners is there are many ways to solve a problem with software architecture, many different ways, maybe unlimited ways. Imagine if you could model the carbon and energy impact of different software architectures that solve a given domain problem prior to writing any code. And factor that in as a cross-functional requirement alongside cost and performance and security. And so right at the earliest stages before any lines of code is written, anything's pushed to a CI/CD pipeline, you can at least put some guardrails around the architectural direction that you head in. I haven't seen that done successfully yet. Maybe I missed it, but I think that'd be really cool to think about and something that is sort of top of mind. Secondly, I just want to give a call out to the Green Software Foundation Summit coming up next month. dozens of in-person and virtual events all around the world. I'm super excited to see some people in person, in some cases for the first time in 2 years. And that, go to the Green Software Foundation website to check it out. That is something on the calendar that I'm really looking forward to.
How could I miss that?
Chris has been involved in that. Actually, I think Chris, I don't think we've ever met in person, have we? So I'll be meeting you in person at the event, I think.
Awesome.
The London event. Yeah.
So there's so many folks at the foundation I need to meet, particularly people from around the place.
Are you tall? I don't know. You don't know. You don't know who, people are quite surprised. I'm quite a tall person. But anyway.
I was literally about to say height is the most surprising thing whenever I've met somewhere. But I'm like, you're so tall, or in some cases not as tall. It's like, you have no idea how.
That's what people say to me.
And I say a lot of the current chairs, many of the projects, so Shimon and Fergus from Two Random Project are both pretty tall. And on this average, someone's going to be there. They're giants.
Yeah, and in terms of my answer, kind of like one thing that, and I don't know if it's just been a number of changes, essentially jobs going up recently. One thing I've noticed, in the world of green software is a number of jobs with the words kind of green or related to green software. I mean, honestly, 2 years ago, if you didn't claw your role yourself inside your organization, there were no jobs out there kind of publicly, posted. It was deeply unlikely. Now I'm seeing, you've both got titles kind of related to green software. I saw Amazon posted up. They've got roles for sustainable solution architects. There's a new role for a green cloud advocacy lead at Microsoft. And I'm seeing more and more, not that often, but more and more kind of roles appear in this space. And I think that's one of the most important indicators of the validity of what we're doing. There is a movement behind this, there is an ecosystem, the business behind it, and that's really what will drive this field, I think, in the future. So it gives me a lot of confidence. Yeah.
What I want to say on that is I think also your leadership and the Green Software Foundation has been a big part of that, because I'm going to say I was watching Build nearly a year ago today when the GSF was announced, and I was on holiday. I text my boss, a few people in the organization, why aren't we in this? What's happening? We love green. What are we doing? Let's get us in there.
Oh wow! Was that the inception story for Avanade?
We were so happy to join. So.
Yeah, it was really good to have you. I'm really, really glad you're here. All right, awesome. So maybe before I wrap up, any other information you want to give? Any tell people where they can find you, socials or anything?
Sure. So you've called me CLJ a few times. That's my initials. So you can find me at CLJ, the two animals, _ the letters CLJ, because so many organizations have Chris's, so that's always me. And I'm on Twitter and GitHub.
Also on Twitter and GitHub, the handle D-Toakley, so D-Toakley.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for being our guest today and also being such active participants and chairs of the foundation. Your leadership and your guidance has just been instrumental in us getting to where we are today, so thank you. Thanks for listening to Environment Variables. All the resources for this podcast, including links to our guests and more about open source green software, as well as the Green Software Foundation, are in the show description below. We hope you enjoyed the show and see you on the next one. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show, and of course, we want more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.